The wind howled like a wounded beast, tearing through the skeletal trees of Black Hollow Forest. The moon, a pale, sickly sliver, hung low in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to writhe and twist as if alive. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves, but beneath it all, there was something else, something metallic, coppery, and wrong. It was the smell of blood, old and fresh, mingling together in a nauseating perfume. The villagers of Black Hollow never ventured into the forest after dark. They spoke of things that lurked in the shadows, things with glowing eyes and teeth like razors. They called them the Hounds of Darkness, though no one had ever seen them and lived to tell the tale. The stories were passed down through generations, whispered in hushed tones around crackling fires. The hounds were said to be born from the void itself, creatures of pure malice that fed on fear and flesh. They were the reason the villagers nailed their windows shut at night and hung iron horseshoes above their doors. But tonight, the forest was not empty. A lone figure stumbled through the underbrush, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His name was Elias, and he was a fool. He had laughed at the stories, mocked the villagers for their superstitions. Just old wives' tales, he had said, his voice dripping with arrogance. But now, as the branches clawed at his face and the darkness pressed in around him, he wasn't so sure. He had been running for what felt like hours, though he couldn't be certain. Time had lost all meaning in the suffocating blackness of the forest. His legs burned, and his chest felt like it was on fire, but he couldn't stop. Not now, not after what he had seen. It had started with a sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Elias had frozen, his heart pounding in his ears. Then came the eyes, two pinpricks of light, glowing like embers in the dark. They were far away at first, but they grew closer, brighter, until he could see the shape of the thing they belonged to. It was a hound, but unlike any hound Elias had ever seen. It was massive, its shoulders reaching his waist, its body lean and muscular, covered in fur so black it seemed to absorb the surrounding light. Its eyes burned with an unnatural fire, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. Saliva dripped from its jaws, sizzling as it hit the ground. Elias had turned and run, and the hound had followed. Now, as he crashed through the forest, he could hear it behind him, its paws pounding against the earth, its breath hot on his neck. He dared not look back, but he could feel it gaining on him, its growls growing louder, more frenzied. He could almost feel its teeth sinking into his flesh, tearing him apart. And then, just as he thought he couldn't run any further, he saw it, a light. Faint and flickering, but unmistakable. A cabin. Hope surged through him, and he pushed his body to its limits, his legs screaming in protest as he sprinted toward the light. He burst through the door, slamming it shut behind him and throwing the bolt. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished, but it was warm, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Elias leaned against the door, his chest heaving, his legs trembling beneath him. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from outside, came a sound that made his blood run cold. A howl, long and mournful, filled with a hunger that made his stomach churn. It was joined by another, and another, until the air was filled with a cacophony of howls, each one more terrifying than the last. Elias stumbled away from the door, his eyes darting around the cabin. There had to be something he could use to defend himself, a weapon, anything. His eyes fell on an old hunting rifle hanging above the fireplace. He grabbed it, his hands shaking as he checked the chamber. It was loaded. The howls grew louder, closer. Elias could hear the hounds outside, their claws scraping against the wood of the cabin, their breath hot against the windows. He raised the rifle, aiming it at the door, his finger hovering over the trigger. And then, the door began to shake. It started as a faint tremor, but it grew stronger, more violent, until the entire cabin seemed to shudder with the force of it. The hounds were throwing themselves against the door, their growls turning into snarls of rage. The wood groaned under the pressure, and Elias knew it wouldn't hold for long. He backed away, his eyes fixed on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The firelight flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. And then he saw it, a shadow, darker than the rest, moving on its own. It slithered across the floor, up the wall, until it loomed over him, a shapeless mass of pure darkness. Elias's breath caught in his throat as the shadow began to take shape. It stretched and twisted, forming into something vaguely humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its head too large, its eyes glowing with the same fiery light as the hounds outside. It opened its mouth, revealing a void of endless blackness, and spoke in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream. "You should not have come here." The door splintered, and the hounds poured in. The door exploded inward with a deafening crash, sending shards of wood flying like jagged teeth. Elias stumbled back, the rifle slipping from his trembling hands as the hounds surged into the cabin. Their eyes burned like hellfire, their snarls a symphony of hunger and rage. The air grew thick with the stench of wet fur and rotting meat, and the heat of their breath made the room feel like an oven. The first hound lunged at him, its jaws snapping shut inches from his face. Elias screamed, throwing himself to the side as the creature's teeth grazed his shoulder, tearing through his jacket and drawing blood. He scrambled to his feet, his back hitting the wall as the hound turned, its glowing eyes locking onto him. The others circled, their movements unervingly precise, like predators savoring the moment before the kill. The shadowy figure in the corner began to laugh, a sound that was neither human nor animal, but something far worse. It was a sound that seemed to crawl inside Elias's skull, scratching at his mind like 1,000 tiny claws. The figure's glowing eyes narrowed, and it raised a hand, its long, bony fingers curling as if to beckon the hounds forward. Elias's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything he could use to defend himself. The rifle was too far away, lying near the shattered door. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting flickering light across the room, and his gaze fell on the iron poker leaning against the stone fireplace. Iron. The villagers had always said iron could ward off evil. With a desperate cry, Elias lunged for the poker, his fingers closing around the cold metal just as another hound leaped at him. He swung blindly, the iron connecting with the creature's skull with a sickening thud. The hound yelped, a sound that was almost pitiful, and collapsed to the floor, its body twitching. The others hesitated, their growls faltering for the first time. The shadowy figure hissed, its form flickering like a dying flame. "Foolish mortal," it spat, its voice echoing as if it came from the very walls of the cabin. "You think you can defy me? You think you can escape?" Elias tightened his grip on the poker, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "I'll kill them all if I have to." The figure's laughter filled the room again, louder this time, more deranged. "Kill them," it sneered. "You cannot kill what is already dead. They are mine, bound to me for eternity. And soon you will be too." The hounds began to advance again, their growls deepening, their eyes glowing brighter. Elias swung the poker wildly, keeping them at bay, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they overwhelmed him. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but the cabin was small, and the hounds were everywhere. And then he noticed it, a trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden beneath a threadbare rug. It was his only chance. He swung the poker one last time, forcing the hounds to back away, and then dove for the trapdoor, yanking it open. The stench of damp earth and decay wafted up from the darkness below, but he didn't hesitate. He dropped into the hole, pulling the trapdoor shut above him just as the hounds lunged. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on him from all sides. He fumbled in his pocket for the lighter he always carried, his hands shaking so badly he could barely flick it open. The flames sputtered to life, casting a weak, flickering light around him. He was in a narrow tunnel, the walls lined with rough-hewn stones slick with moisture. The air was cold and heavy, and the sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. But there was something else, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like the beating of a massive heart. It seemed to come from deep within the tunnel, growing louder as he listened. And beneath it, faint but unmistakable, was the sound of whispers. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking at once, their words overlapping into a cacophony of madness. Elias knew he had no choice but to move forward. The hounds were still above him, their claws scraping against the trapdoor as they tried to reach him. He could hear the shadowy figure's laughter echoing through the floorboards, taunting him, mocking him. He gripped the poker tightly and began to crawl down the tunnel, the lighter's flame casting eerie shadows on the walls. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning like the intestines of some great beast. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their words just on the edge of comprehension. He thought he heard his name, spoken in a voice that was both familiar and alien. The thumping grew louder too, vibrating through the stone beneath him, making his teeth rattle. And then, the tunnel opened up into a cavern. The lighter's flame was too weak to illuminate the entire space, but what Elias could see made his stomach churn. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the stone and painted with something dark and sticky that smelled like blood. The floor was littered with bones, some human, some animal, all picked clean and broken. In the center of the cavern was a massive pit, its edges lined with jagged stones. The thumping was coming from within it, louder now, more urgent. Elias approached the pit cautiously, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices screaming in his mind. He peered over the edge, the lighter's flame flickering as it struggled to pierce the darkness. And then he saw it. At the bottom of the pit was a heart, a massive, pulsating heart, its surface slick with blood. Veins and arteries snaked out from it, burrowing into the walls of the pit like roots. The thumping was the sound of it beating, each pulse sending a wave of dread through Elias's body. And then, the heart opened, a gaping, toothless maw that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, deep and resonant, speaking words that Elias could not understand but felt in the very core of his being. "You are mine," it said. "You have always been mine." Elias stumbled back, his mind unraveling at the edges. He turned to run, but the tunnel was gone, replaced by a solid wall of stone. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the heart's thumping became a deafening roar. He could feel it pulling at him, drawing him closer, its maw opening wider and wider. And then, from above, came the sound of the hounds howling, a sound that was no longer filled with hunger, but with triumph. The cavern seemed to close in around Elias, the walls pulsating as if they were alive, breathing in sync with the monstrous heart in the pit. The whispers swirled around him, their voices clawing at his sanity, each word a needle piercing his mind. He pressed his hands to his ears, but it did nothing to block the sound. It was inside him, part of him, and he couldn't escape it. The heart's maw stretched wider, its fleshy walls glistening with a thick, black ichor that dripped and pooled at the bottom of the pit. The thumping grew louder, more insistent, each beat reverberating through Elias's bones. He could feel it in his chest, his own heart struggling to keep pace, as if it were being pulled toward the abomination before him. "You cannot run," the voice boomed, its tone both mocking and triumphant. "You were chosen, marked. Your fear feeds me. Your flesh will sustain me." Elias's legs gave out, and he collapsed to his knees, the iron poker slipping from his grasp. His vision blurred, the cavern spinning around him as the whispers grew into a deafening roar. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, his voice stolen by the terror that gripped him. And then something changed. The whispers faltered, their chaotic chorus breaking into fragments. The heart's thumping stuttered, its rhythm disrupted. Elias blinked, his vision clearing just enough to see a faint glow emanating from his chest. He looked down, his trembling hands pulling at the fabric of his shirt. There, just above his heart, was a mark, a symbol etched into his skin, glowing with a soft, golden light. It was the same symbol carved into the walls of the cavern, but where those were dark and menacing, this one felt pure. The heart let out a guttural roar, its maw snapping shut as if in pain. The veins and arteries that connected it to the walls of the pit writhed and recoiled, black ichor spraying into the air. The whispers turned to screams, the voices of the damned howling in agony. Elias didn't understand what was happening, but he knew he had to act. He grabbed the iron poker and forced himself to his feet, his body trembling but his resolve hardening. The glow from the mark on his chest grew brighter, pushing back the darkness that surrounded him. The heart's thumping became erratic, its beats uneven and weak. "No!" the voice shrieked, its tone desperate now. "You cannot defy me. I am eternal. I am." Elias didn't let it finish. With a cry of defiance, he drove the iron poker into the heart's pulsating flesh. The reaction was immediate and violent. The heart convulsed, black ichor erupting from the wound like a geyser. The cavern shook, chunks of stone falling from the ceiling as the walls began to collapse. The whispers turned to wails, the voices fading into nothingness. Elias stumbled back, the glow from his chest fading as the heart's thumping slowed to a stop. The cavern was crumbling around him, the air filled with dust and the sound of cracking stone. He turned and ran, his legs carrying him through the tunnel as it collapsed behind him. The hound's howls echoed from above, but they were different now, filled with pain and confusion. He reached the trapdoor and shoved it open, scrambling out of the tunnel just as the floor gave way beneath him. The cabin was in ruins, the walls splintered and the roof partially collapsed. The hounds were gone, their presence replaced by an eerie silence. The shadowy figure was nowhere to be seen. Elias collapsed onto the floor, his body trembling with exhaustion. The mark on his chest had faded, leaving only a faint scar. He didn't know what had happened or why, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to get out of Black Hollow Forest. As he staggered to his feet and stumbled out of the cabin, the first light of dawn began to break through the trees. The forest was still, the air crisp and clean, as if the horrors of the night had never happened. But Elias knew better. He could still feel the weight of the heart's gaze, the echoes of its voice in his mind. He didn't look back as he made his way through the forest, his steps slow but determined. The villagers would have questions, but he didn't have any answers. Not yet. All he knew was that the Hounds of Darkness were real, and they were far from defeated. As he reached the edge of the forest, he paused, his eyes scanning the horizon. The village was just ahead, its rooftops bathed in the golden light of the rising sun. But beyond it, in the distance, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing at the edge of the tree line. Its glowing eyes locked onto his, and though it was too far away to hear, he could feel its voice in his mind. This is not over. Elias stood frozen at the edge of Black Hollow Forest, his body trembling as the shadowy figure's words echoed in his mind. The figure was too far away to make out any details, but its presence was undeniable, a towering silhouette that seemed to drink in the surrounding light, leaving only darkness in its wake. Its glowing eyes burned like twin embers, and though it didn't move, Elias could feel its gaze piercing through him, probing his very soul. The villagers would be waking soon, their daily routines oblivious to the horrors that had unfolded in the forest. Elias knew he should warn them, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain what he had seen? How could he make them believe that the stories they had whispered for generations were not just tales, but warnings? And even if they did believe him, what could they do against something so ancient, so malevolent? The figure at the tree line raised a hand, its long, bony fingers curling as if to beckon him. Elias felt a pull, an invisible force tugging at his chest, drawing him back toward the forest. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he fought against the compulsion. The mark on his chest, now a faint scar, began to throb faintly, as if responding to the shadow's call. "No," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible. I won't go back. The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. For a moment, the pull lessened, and Elias took a step back, his legs unsteady. But then the figure's voice returned, louder this time, more insistent. You cannot escape me, Elias. You are mine. You have always been mine. Elias turned and ran, his feet pounding against the dirt path that led to the village. He didn't look back, didn't dare to. The sun was fully above the horizon now, its light warm and comforting, but it did little to ease the chill that had settled deep within him. He could still feel the shadow's gaze on his back, its presence lingering like a foul stench. The village was quiet, the streets empty save for a few early risers tending to their chores. Elias stumbled into the square, his breath coming in ragged gasps. A woman carrying a basket of laundry stopped and stared at him, her eyes widening in alarm. Elias, she asked, her voice trembling. What happened to you? You look like you've seen a ghost. Elias opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His vision blurred, and he swayed on his feet, the exhaustion and adrenaline finally catching up to him. The woman dropped her basket and rushed to his side, catching him as his legs gave out. Someone help! She shouted, her voice echoing through the square. Elias is hurt. The villagers came running, their faces filled with concern and curiosity. They carried Elias to the nearest house, laying him down on a cot and tending to his wounds. His jacket was torn, his shoulder bleeding from where the hound's teeth had grazed him. His hands were scraped and bruised, and his face was pale, his eyes haunted. What happened to you? An old man asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. You look like you've been through hell. Elias took a deep breath, his mind racing. He knew he had to tell them, but the words felt heavy, impossible to speak. How could he explain the heart in the pit, the shadowy figure, the hounds? How could he make them understand that the forest was alive, that it was watching them, waiting for them? The forest, he finally said, his voice hoarse. It's just not what we thought. The stories, they're true. All of them. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, their faces pale. The old man leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. What did you see, Elias? Elias hesitated, his gaze flickering to the window. The forest was visible in the distance, its trees dark and foreboding even in the sunlight. He could still feel the shadow's presence, its voice whispering in the back of his mind. I saw the hounds, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And something else, something worse. It's in the forest. It's been there all along, feeding on us, on our fear. And it's not done. It's coming. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. The villagers looked at each other, their faces filled with fear and disbelief. The old man straightened, his expression grim. We need to call a meeting, he said. Everyone needs to hear this. The village square was packed. The entire population of Black Hollow gathered to hear Elias's story. He stood on a makeshift platform, his body still weak, but his voice steady as he recounted everything that had happened. He told them about the hounds, the shadowy figure, the heart in the pit. He showed them the mark on his chest, now a faint scar, but still visible. The villagers listened in stunned silence, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. When he finished, the square erupted into chaos. Some villagers shouted in anger, accusing Elias of lying or losing his mind. Others wept, clutching their children close. The old man who had helped Elias earlier stepped forward, raising his hands to quiet the crowd. Enough, he barked, his voice cutting through the noise. We can't afford to fight among ourselves. Whether we believe Elias or not, something is wrong. The forest has always been dangerous, but now it feels different. We need to be prepared. Prepared for what? A woman shouted, her voice trembling. If what he's saying is true, how can we fight something like that? The old man hesitated, his gaze flickering to Elias. I don't know, he admitted, but we can't just sit here and wait for it to come for us. We need to protect ourselves. We need to find answers. Elias stepped forward, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. There's a way, he said. The mark, it protected me. I don't know how or why, but it did. Maybe there's a way to use it, to fight back. The villagers fell silent, their eyes fixed on Elias. The old man nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Then we'll start there," he said. "We'll search the old texts, the stories. There has to be something we've missed." As the villagers dispersed, Elias stayed behind, his gaze fixed on the forest. The shadowy figure was gone, but he could still feel its presence, a weight pressing down on his chest. He didn't know what they would find, or if it would be enough. But he knew one thing for certain. The Hounds of Darkness were real, and they were only the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of frantic activity. The villagers of Black Hollow, though divided in their beliefs, were united by a shared sense of dread. Elias's story had shaken them to their core, and even the most skeptical among them couldn't ignore the unease that now hung over the village like a storm cloud. The old man, whose name was revealed to be Abram, took charge of organizing the search for answers. He was the village's unofficial historian, a keeper of old tales and forgotten lore, and if anyone could uncover the truth about the Hounds of Darkness, it was him. Elias spent his days poring over ancient texts and crumbling scrolls alongside Abram and a handful of others. The village's library was small, tucked away in the back of Abram's home, but it was filled with books and documents that dated back generations. Many of the texts were written in languages no one could read, their pages filled with strange symbols and illustrations that made Elias's skin crawl. But among the chaos, they began to find patterns. References to a heart of the void, a shadow-bound king, and a ritual that could banish the darkness forever. The ritual required three things: a vessel of pure iron, a sacrifice of blood, and a soul marked by the light. Elias's mark, they realized, was the key. It was a symbol of resistance, a fragment of light that had somehow survived the void's corruption. But the ritual came with a cost, one that Elias wasn't sure he was willing to pay. As the villagers prepared for the ritual, the forest grew restless. Strange sounds echoed from the trees at night. Howls that didn't sound like any animal, whispers that carried on the wind, and the occasional glimpse of glowing eyes in the darkness. The hounds were growing bolder. Their presence felt even in the safety of the village. Livestock went missing, their remains found torn apart and scattered. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and children spoke of seeing a tall, dark figure watching them from the edge of the forest. Elias knew they were running out of time. The night of the ritual was cold and still, the air heavy with anticipation. The villagers gathered in the square, their faces pale and their eyes filled with fear. A circle had been drawn in the dirt, its edges lined with iron nails and salt. In the center stood a crude altar made of stone, and on it rested an iron blade, its surface etched with the same symbol that marked Elias's chest. Abram stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "We've done all we can," he said. "The rest is up to you, Elias." Elias nodded, his heart pounding as he approached the altar. The mark on his chest glowed faintly, its light pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He picked up the blade, its weight unfamiliar in his hands, and turned to face the forest. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The hounds were out there, waiting, and so was the shadow. "I'm ready," Elias said, though his voice trembled. Abram placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. "Remember, the ritual requires a sacrifice. You must be willing to give everything." Elias swallowed hard, his mind racing. He thought of the villagers, of the children who had looked to him with hope, of the families who had taken him in when he had nowhere else to go. He thought of the shadow's voice, its promises of eternal torment. And he thought of the heart in the pit, its thumping echoing in his mind. He stepped into the circle, the iron nails and salt crunching beneath his feet. The villagers began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic, the words of an ancient prayer filling the air. Elias raised the blade, its edge glinting in the moonlight, and pressed it to his palm. The pain was sharp and immediate, but he didn't flinch. Blood welled up, dripping onto the altar and sizzling as it touched the iron. The forest erupted. The hounds burst from the trees, their eyes blazing and their teeth bared. The villagers screamed, their chants faltering as the creatures charged toward the square. But the circle held, the iron and salt creating a barrier the hounds couldn't cross. They snarled and snapped at the edge, their frustration growing with each failed attempt. And then, the shadow appeared. It emerged from the forest, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Its glowing eyes locked onto Elias, and its voice filled the air, a cacophony of whispers and screams. "You cannot win," it said, its tone dripping with malice. "You are mine." Elias tightened his grip on the blade, his blood dripping steadily onto the altar. The mark on his chest burned, its light growing brighter with each passing moment. He could feel the ritual taking hold, the power of the light coursing through him. But he could also feel the shadow's pull, its darkness clawing at the edges of his mind. "I'm not yours," Elias said, his voice steady despite the fear in his heart. "I never was." He plunged the blade into the altar, the iron shattering as the light from his mark exploded outward. The hounds howled, their bodies disintegrating into ash as the light consumed them. The shadow screamed, its form unraveling as the light tore through it. The forest seemed to shudder, the trees bending and twisting as if in pain. And then silence. The light faded, leaving the square bathed in moonlight. The hounds were gone, their ashes scattered on the wind. The shadow was nowhere to be seen, its presence erased. The villagers stood in stunned silence, their faces filled with awe and relief. Elias collapsed to his knees, the blade slipping from his hand. The mark on his chest was gone, its light extinguished. He felt empty, drained, but alive. The ritual had worked. The darkness had been banished. Abram rushed to his side, his hands trembling as he helped Elias to his feet. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "You saved us." Elias shook his head, his gaze fixed on the forest. "It's not over," he said quietly. "The shadow is gone, but the forest is still there. And it's still watching." The villagers followed his gaze, their relief giving way to unease. The forest was quiet now, its trees still and silent. But the darkness within it was palpable, a reminder that some evils could never truly be destroyed. Elias turned away, his heart heavy but resolute. The Hounds of Darkness were gone, but the fight wasn't over. The forest would always be there, waiting, and so would he.